we're going to start with Karen. She was born in Istanbul, and she has several degrees. Her bachelor's degree is in English language, and she has master's degrees in social psychology and applied linguistics. And she wrote her thesis on Judeo-Spanish language. And so uh, she also founded the Sephardic Culture Research Center, and she is the founder and presenter of the group Los Parashos Sephardi.
Pasharos. Pasharos.
Thank you for correcting me.
You're muted, Mark.
Can you hear me now?
Yes,
Did you hear my intro?
some of it. Well, yeah, probably.
Okay. Sorry about getting on mute. I'm not sure how that happened. So Karen, why don't you start with your presentation?
Okay, then. Hello, everyone. How are you in these wonderful times? It's beautiful weather in Istanbul. Should be snowing, but it's not. The day was 16 degrees Celsius. Really, it's like spring. So nice. Okay, what I'll be doing tonight is give a general background for the Turkish Sephardic culture. A little bit of history, actually. We won't go into culture much tonight. We will do that in the following sessions on music, language, and food. That should be interesting. So what I will be doing tonight is just give you a general background for what we're doing here, okay? So I will not start with the PowerPoint yet. What I would like to do is to tell you that, well, the Sephardic Jews came to they were living in Spain. Nicely, I would say, for hundreds and hundreds of years before the infamous Queen Isabella and her equally infamous king, Ferdinand, decided to build a united Spain. And they thought, the best way to do that was to throw out all the elements that were not Catholic from their country. So they wanted a united Catholic Spain. So that meant that all the Jews and all the Muslims had to leave. And so that's what they did. And now I would like, just as a matter of interest, I would like to show you what is called the Edicto de Expulsión. Let me just start the slideshow. Okay, so here's the Edicto de Expulsión. Well, you can find this on the internet actually, but the things that I highlighted here are the important sentences there. And it says, acordamos de mandar salir a todos los judíos de nuestros reinos que jamás tornen, ni vuelvan a ellos. So this is important because it says we want all the Jews to just leave our kingdoms, and this is an important word, que jamás tornen, they should never return. And they want que salgan con sus filhos y fillas y criados y criadas y familiares judíos. So they want them to leave with all their sons and daughters and everything, all their families and everybody, they have to leave. And then if they do come back, that will be incurran en pena de muerte y confiscación de todos sus bienes para la nuestra cámara. So if they do return, then they will be put to death and all their goods will be confiscated, which it was what this was all about, actually. Money, as usual. Throughout history, you see everything that is in conflict is about either sex or power. So here it was a matter of power, and for power, they needed the money that the Jews could provide. And then they say here it is important that they have to take with them, but they can't take is silver, gold, monies, or other valuable things, which means they were sending them out without anything. Okay. Now, I'm sure you've seen this map 1,000 times. I mean, it's a very popular map on the internet. But you can see here what's important is that you see points of exit from what was Spain at that particular time. So you see there was at first some migration to Portugal, because until the Inquisition arrived in Portugal, there was some who went, well, from Portugal. Then there were waves of people who went to the New World, the Americas, and others who went to northwest of Europe and England. Then from here you see to France and north of France. And from here, you see that that was a very small kind of way to go from the south of Spain into Morocco. And from the east of Spain at that particular time, there were a lot of people who left to go to the Ottoman Empire, uh, whose Sultan, Bayezid II, said he would receive anybody who came to his lands. There's rumors that he even sent some ships to take people. I don't know if that's true. So you see, a lot of people, a lot of people came to, well, maybe the Middle East, but most of them, and they say it's like, some historians say 200,000 people, some historians say 100,000 people. They can never agree on a specific number, but most of them, the Jews that came from Spain, settled in the, oops, yeah, I want to go back. Yes. They settled in Western Anatolia, Thrace, and the Balkans. That was where the bulk of those people who came to the Ottoman Empire settled. So you see, all this was the Ottoman Empire. And so they settled there. Now, when the Jews left Spain, of course, what they spoke was not an organized or standardized language like Spanish is today. There wasn't a standardized Spanish at that particular time. So here are the little kingdoms all around the Iberian Peninsula. And then they also conquered Granada, obviously. And so you have all these little kingdoms, and the Jews were dispersed everywhere in this peninsula, and they spoke the dialect of the place where they were living. So, and none of these dialects were specifically standardized Spanish. Obviously, I mean, in Aragon they spoke Aragonese, which later I think became Catalan. In Castilla, which was the bigger kingdom, they spoke Castellano, but they spoke also Gallego, and they spoke all these other dialects, okay? So, points of interest. Antonio de Nebrija, for example, was the first philologist to write a standardized grammar of Spanish, and he published this Gramática Castellana at the end of 1492, after the Jews left, and the beginning of 1943. And he dedicated it to Queen Isabella, who looked at it and said, what am I going to do with it? I mean, she obviously didn't know anything about that. Nebrija then published his first Latin-Spanish dictionary in 1492 and its Spanish-Latin counterpart in 1495. So all this was happening after, exactly, or right after the Jews left Spain, or the Spanish Peninsula. And his last work, Reglas de Ortografía en la Lengua Castellana, which is the grammatical laws of the language, that was published in 1523, way after the Jews left. And and other points of interest, because I'm a linguist. So here you see from the I took these from the Edicto de Expulsión. So you see these, that like there's a C with a cedilla that was used: participación, conversación, comunicación. Now this cedilla, C with a cedilla, was pronounced as a S sound. And the sound that today exists with these words like participación, conversación, comunicación, that did not exist. Most probably there was a king with a lisp, and that's when that th sound came to exist, probably. Other points of interest, for example, se ha fecho or face, if is the verb hacer, which is hacer in modern Spanish, which means to do. And in Salonika and the Balkans, they have kept the F at the beginning of these words. And it disappeared in Istanbul, for example. And fasta and fin, desde mes de julio, fasta, fista, hasta. So you see, fijos, fijas, or haciendas and ciudad. So you see all these different forms of writing. So nothing to do with modern Spanish, actually. It was way, way before. Now I like this map, even though it has some errors in it, because it shows how huge the Ottoman Empire was, actually. All this red is, but of course, Morocco never belonged to the Ottoman Empire. So that's wrong. And so I'm not sure it goes down until here, but anyway, it's a very, red Ottoman Empire. But the Jews were here. They settled here in this section of the map. Now, the Jews settled mainly in the Aegean region, Istanbul, Thrace, and the Balkans. Istanbul, Edirne, Izmir, Salonika were the centers of culture and learning. These cities are very important. As soon as the Jews arrived in the Ottoman Empire, they started their printing press. That was 1493, and that is very impressive, because the Ottoman printing press came like 300 years later. Now, this is very important. According to the Ottoman rule, the minorities were considered dhimmi. In Turkish, it is zimmi, which means under the protection of. So the dhimmis, as they are called, were under the protection of the empire. And the communities, they ruled themselves mainly through, talking about the Jewish communities, through the Bet Din, that was the religious administration. There was a chief kind of rabbi with the other rabbis in the Bet Din, who decided on the administration of the whole community. They also were, good lawyers as well, because that's what they were trained in. And as long as they paid their taxes to the authorities, nobody interfered, really. I mean, they kind of were allowed to rule themselves. And this is very important, because it's important because of one thing, actually. People never imposed anything on them. They didn't impose language. They didn't impose religion. So that is why a very rare phenomenon occurred, and that the Sephardic Jews, as they came to call themselves, Sepharad, meaning Spain, obviously. Now everybody knows that. And So they kind of were able to preserve their culture. And this is something that you don't see very much in immigrant cultures. I mean, usually uh, what you see is after 4 generations, nothing remains of the original mother culture, and there's complete adaptation. But with the Ottoman Empire, because of this very specific rule, specific administration of the Ottoman Empire, the Sephardic Jews were able to preserve whatever they brought to the empire. Now, this is just as I was saying, you know, they had their printing press. So this was the alphabet that they were using to print their mostly religious books. And it's called the Rashi alphabet. And here, the little things here you see are the handwritten form, the Solitreo. But we'll see that later on in. Now, in 1860 is an important milestone in the culture of the Sephardic Jews because it's the foundation of the Alliance Israélite Universelle schools throughout the empire. Now, the Alliance Israélite Universelle is a French institution and Jewish institution, and its statutes state that they're here to bring enlightenment to the retarded communities of the East. So we obviously were one of those retarded communities. And this brought the introduction to the Latin alphabet, which brought with itself a lot of social changes as a result of this education that was provided by the Alliance schools. Obviously, the Alliance schools taught in French. They were French medium. And for the first time, the women started studying in schools. And this was, you know, 1860 already. And the women had not been studying, had not been going to school. It's just the boys who went to the yeshivas. So a lot happens when the women just get out of the house, get out of the home environment. When women get out, then you have to pay the price. Okay, it's good, it's nice, it's progress, but there's always a price to pay, and that happens with the decreased transmission of culture and values. Okay, that's what we said. Now, then comes the Turkish Republic, 1923, and that's the foundation of the Turkish Republic. This brought the introduction to the Latin alphabet. What? Yeah, okay, Latin alphabet. Also, in 1934, there were a lot of reforms in Turkey, and with it came the alphabet reform, the dress reform, all sorts of reform. And of course, there were also very turbulent times in the building of a national state. So in 1934, there was the Thrace events, and the Jews were asked to leave, and they had to leave Thrace in one night. The economy changed hands from Jewish or non-Muslim hands into Muslim hands. 1942 was the wealth tax. 41, 42, 20 classes were called to military service. Fathers and sons were enlisted at the same time. And then 1955, the 6th, 7th September, false news caused an uprising against the Greeks, but people didn't know, you know, non-Muslims are non-Muslims, who is Greek, who is Jewish, who is Armenian, nobody knows. So all these things caused a lot of leaving. I mean, at the beginning of the 20th century, there were about 250,000 Jews in the Ottoman Empire, what was left of it. And so, I mean, in the Balkans, Hitler took care of the communities there, unfortunately. And here in Turkey, all these events caused a lot of people to leave. And in modern times now, today, we are a small Jewish community, around 15,000, and most of us live in Istanbul, around 1,000 people in Izmir, and a handful here and there in other cities. We have in Istanbul 19 open and functioning synagogues, and we have a chief rabbinate that deals with administrative purposes. We have schools from kindergarten to the end of lycée, a hospital, an old people's home, and many, many caritative institutions. We have youth clubs, other social institutions, and that organize mainly cultural activities from the community. And the most popular of which is the theater. We all love to act and also to watch, especially comedies about ourselves, because we love to laugh at ourselves. And of course, this is the end of my speech. If you want some reading materials in Ladino or about the culture or the music or the cookbooks, etc., visit our website, istanbulsephardiccenter.com. And that brings me to the end of my speech. There
Thank
you
you
go.
very much, Karen. That was
20
very
minutes
interesting.
on the dot.
So this is a good starting point. There's obviously a lot more history there, and to be able to encapsulate that in, just a few minutes is mind-boggling. But this is just whetting our appetite for more information, as Karen has shown us. So I would encourage everybody to, research and find out more about our culture. It's such a wonderful thing. So our next speaker, Dr. Pamela Dorn Sezgin, is professor of anthropology and history at the University of North Georgia's Oconee campus. And she's a graduate and holds a PhD and master's. And she's a specialist in the history and cultures of the late Ottoman Empire, with a special emphasis on Sephardic Jews and Greeks in Istanbul. And she also serves on the scientific committee and editorial boards for several projects of the Green Lines Institute of Portugal, an NGO. So, and has published quite a few things that she will touch on. So without further ado, Pam.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you very much for organizing this program today and the other series of lectures, which look very interesting. And thank you all for being here. Welcome to everyone. Today, I will talk about the role that Italian Jews played in the transformation of the economic, social, and cultural life of the late Ottoman Empire in the 19th century, the century prior to World War I. This case study provides a view into the rather hidden world of complex identities, changing political affiliations, and transnational networks. Most importantly, a dynamic new niche for economic opportunity emerged at the same time that power was shifting in Europe among political states. A new elite class of Jewish entrepreneurs emerged who responded to the changing world around them with creativity, developing new industries and charitable organizations to incubate educational and social reforms. Identifying the Italian Jews in the Ottoman Empire is problematic. Today, we exaggerate the importance of nation states or countries in our lives, in our own ideas about self, family, and group affiliation. We're Greek, or we're Turkish, or we're Americans. But during most of the long duration of the Ottoman Empire, Italy, as one political entity, a nation state, did not exist. So when we say Italy, we're mostly talking about a geographic region, the Italian peninsula. Italy as a nation state was only officially organized in 1861, and even that date is in dispute. Il Risorgimento, the process of unifying various Italian-speaking kingdoms and city-states on the Italian peninsula and in adjacent areas, took place between 1815, the Congress of Vienna at the end of Napoleonic rule, and 1871, when Rome became the capital of Italy. Its borders were further changed during World War I and II. In the Ottoman Empire, city-states and rival mercantile empires of Genoa and Venice established settlements. These settlements predate the Ottoman Empire. For example, the Genoese established the Galata district, and their towers still there today, across the Halich, or the Golden Horn, from Byzantine Constantinopolis. They were allowed to stay via a series of treaties when the Ottomans took Constantinople in 1453. Venetians, though, were also in Galata and played an important commercial and diplomatic role in the Ottoman-Venetian imperial rivalry during the early modern period. Language is the key feature in identifying Italians, both prior to the formation of their 19th century nation state and as a criterion for group membership. La questione della lingua first arose in the 15th and 16th centuries in Tuscany in an attempt to codify the linguistic norms of Dante, Petrarch, and Boccaccio. And so a foundation formed in 1583 published dictionaries and authoritative texts standardizing the language of Florentine Italian literature. And the dialect of Florence, of Firenze, becomes the basis later for modern Italian. But modern Italian doesn't take shape until the 1860s as a national language. In the Ottoman Empire, a synthesis of dialects from the Italian peninsula converged to comprise a special trade language, the lingua franca, which was used for commerce throughout the Mediterranean, as well as for nautical or shipping terms. Lingua franca utilized loanwords from both Italian and Greek. The Venetian Latin Rite Christians who lived in Galata in Istanbul or Constantinople in the early modern period were mostly Greek speaking. It is worth noting that in the Ottoman Jewish community, Livorno, Ancona, Apulia also played important roles linguistically and culturally, in addition to Genoa, Venice, and Florence. Migration also played a role in defining Italian identity, but it was not one directional. Jews migrated throughout the Ottoman centuries back and forth from the Italian peninsula, and the names of their synagogues in places like Salonika and Constantinople often referenced their origin. Livorno, of course, was the center of publishing for Jewish religious texts, and some Sephardic Jews who fled expulsions and subsequent inquisitions in Iberia settled on the Italian peninsula. Their descendants moved further east to Ottoman domains and then back again, or to different Italian city-states and other places in Middle Europe, fleeing the restrictions of the Papal States. One further element of identity was religious rite, or minhag. In Hebrew, the Italian Jewish rite is encoded in the term for Italian Jews, Italkim. While there are subgroups within this category, the main distinction is that the Italian rite is a bridge between Sephardic and Ashkenazic patterns of worship. One important quality, though, is that the Italkim maintained their distinctive liturgical rites because of two factors. One was Livorno, where Jewish prayer books were published. And the second factor was the use of music in the Italian rite service. Italy has a tremendous history in the development of Western classical music. Melodies from some of these composers, both Jews and non-Jews, Jews like Salomon Rossi and non-Jews like Benedetto Marcello were used in the synagogues long before the reforms made in Judaism in the late 19th and 20th centuries to utilize instruments in synagogue worship. So the Italians did that first. In the Ottoman Empire, Italian Jews were often called Los Francos, the Franks or the Europeans. But it's not exclusively a term for just Italian Jews. It means any European Jewish family. Layer of that. And the Jewish term Los Francos was a companion term to the term Levantinos. The Levantines in the Ottoman Empire were Christians. They were often Latin Rite Christians who lived in Pera in Istanbul in the shadow of the Galata Tower, as well as settlements of Europeans doing business in Izmir or Izmirna in the south. The people in this category constituted transnational families who established trade networks in the Eastern Mediterraneans over several generations. And particularly they were in commerce and shipping, the so-called Turkey trade. In the 19th century, they were at the forefront of modern banking, making loans to finance the Ottoman Empire's fledgling industries and wars. Ottoman Armenians, Greeks, and Jews were involved in these endeavors, as were foreign merchant families from the British and Austro-Hungarian empires. Both terms, Los Francos and the Levantines, came to be associated with Ottoman modernity. Now, all of the padishahs in the 19th century, starting with the late 18th century with Üçüncü or Third Selim, throughout until up until the end of the empire, actually, were concerned with making reforms and modernizing. Selim III instituted the Nizam-i-Jadid, the new order, to centralize the power in his government and make the empire more competitive with European rivals. One critical aspect of this program was that the Janissaries, Yenicheri, an elite and powerful fighting force, would have to be either brought under tighter control or eliminated. Selim failed, and in fact, the Janissaries assassinated him in 1808, but Selim's brother, Mahmud II, was able to abolish them in 1826. This action had consequences for the Jewish community, whose leadership were closely associated with the Janissaries. Jews were contractors and money lenders or gold dealers. Saraf is the term in Ottoman Turkish, a traditional financing system that predated modern banking in the empire. Benjamin Bohor Carmona, the president of the Istanbul Jewish community, whose profitable livelihood was closely tied to the Janissaries, was executed on Mahmud II's orders, leaving the Jewish community without leadership for a time. Another Jewish merchant, Saraf, was uncomfortable seeing these tensions arising between the Janissaries and the emperor. Predicting that there would be no good outcome, he took his family to Trieste, the Habsburg port city on the Adriatic Sea, thereby changing their fate for the next 200 years. This spice merchant was Haim Kamundo, who arrived in Trieste on October 6, 1782, where he built a new fortune. Trieste was important as an olive oil and coffee port. It was the gateway to Middle Europe. Haim was so successful that his son, Solomon Jacob Kamundo, was able to return to Istanbul and reestablish there in 1806 as the holder of an Austrian, meaning Austro-Hungarian Empire passport. And his passport was registered in the Italian language. Note that the Modiano family, which had branches in Salonika and Constantinople, have a similar story about an ancestor escaping Ottoman justice and fleeing to Trieste. Saul David Modiano fled to Trieste in the early 19th century too, where he eventually established factories that manufactured cigarette papers and playing cards. Several generations of Camundos succeeded Solomon Jacob in Constantinople, but they were living there as Italians. Trieste was part of the Venetian world. The Camundos had the protection of the Austro-Hungarian emperor. This status gave them special trade privileges and protected them from unpredictable calamities that might befall Ottoman businessmen who moved in the high levels of imperial society. The capitulation, a package of tax-free accommodations for foreigners doing business in the Ottoman Empire, were not static laws. And until the end of the empire, the Ottoman state gave special privileges to foreign businessmen and their proteges, privileges which normal Ottoman subjects were denied. Italian identity for the Camundos, with their Trieste connections and a mythic Venetian past, as well as their newly acquired Austro-Hungarian passports, enabled them to return to Constantinople safely and securely, having shed their status as Ottoman subjects. The Ottoman state recognized these resident foreigners individually with a berat, a decree. And if you had such a decree, commercial agents were called beratle, those possessing that privilege. The Modiano family of Salonika provides an interesting study of the ways in which identities can be manipulated to accommodate the changing political conditions in the Ottoman Empire and Europe as well. The Modianos, also known as Modigliano, Modigliano, Moliano, and Modihanos, were a prominent family in Salonika. Their name comes from the municipality of Modigliana, which is about 50 kilometers southeast of Bologna on the Italian peninsula. The ultimate origin of the family is the mystery. It looks like maybe they came from Ferrara. But anyway, they attained money lending licenses in the 15th and 16th centuries. In the 19th century, there was a strong association of the Modianos with Livorno. Vita Solomon Modigliano arrived in Livorno in 1819 on an Ottoman passport and left as a subject of the Duchy of Tuscany. In 1833, the Modianos of Salonika registered at the Tuscan consulate as citizens of Livorno. And I was lucky 2 years ago to get permission to read in the archives of the Italian Foreign Ministry in Rome. And I read in the 19th century Italian handwriting some of these documents. The Modiano family did not relocate to Livorno, as evidenced by the fact that there are no Modiano graves in the Jewish cemeteries of Livorno. So they were living basically in the Ottoman Empire at this time. Records in the Livornese Matricola or register reference correspondence in French issued between 1819 and 1827 by the French consulate. The importance of French documents is not surprising, since France under Napoleon invaded Tuscany in 1796 and held it until the 1814-1815 Congress of Vienna. In the words of Mario Modiano, it is significant that the Modianos in Salonika should have become Tuscan citizens on the basis of French certificates. The Kingdom of Tuscany made its own capitulation treaty with the Ottoman Empire in 1747. This treaty attracted a large number of proteges who eventually came under the protection of the Austro-Hungarian consulate. Potential proteges could pay a fee to obtain that protection, and they paid the fee to the local consul in Ottoman cities. Il Risorgimento, which stretched from 1815 to 1871, the unification of Italy, of its various city-states and kingdoms into a modern nation state, intensified identification as Italian for upper-class Ottoman Jews. and it created new business opportunities throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. The Congress of Vienna marked the end of the Napoleonic rule, and it delayed the formation of the Italian nation state, but nonetheless helped shape their wars of independence. The Habsburgs' Austrian Empire repressed Italian national sentiment, and there were continuing problems with the Papal States. Italy's formation as a nation state emerged from a series of wars in 1848 in Tuscany, Lombardy, in 1859 in Sardinia, and in 1866, the so-called Austro-Prussian War, when Venice and its holdings were ceded to the modern Italian nation. The Kingdom of Italy was proclaimed on March 17, 1861, and Rome came on board in 1870. Many Italian speakers formed in the newly Italian formed nation state. And at the end of World War I, Italy gained Trieste, some places in Moldava, Istria, and Zara. Italy went on to annex Split or Spolato, which today belongs to Croatia, Kotor, which today is in Montenegro, and most of Dalmatia in the early 1940s, as well as Corsica and even Nice during World War II. But these areas were eventually returned to other neighboring nation states. So what did the formation of an Italian nation state mean for the Italian Jews of the Ottoman Empire? It meant there was a growing connection with the Italian consulate in Constantinople and other Ottoman cities, as well as increased interaction with Christian Levantines, and eventually active lobbying of the Ottoman state for the separate recognition of an Italian Jewish millet. Karen talked about the dhimmi status of protected minorities in the Ottoman Empire. And in the 19th century, during the Tanzimat or reform period, the non-Muslim groups in the Ottoman Empire were reorganized and also given nizamname, or their own constitutions about their communal organization and how to administer their schools and charitable associations. So during this period, the Italian Jews who had Italian citizenship, lobbied and got their own millet in 1866. And after 1861, with the formation of modern Italy, births, marriages, and deaths of Jews in places like Salonika who held Italian citizenship were reported in the municipalities like Livorno, the municipalities to which they were supposed to have immigrated from. But many of these families were Ottoman Jewish throughout the whole period. By 1862, the Italian Jewish community of Istanbul was officially founded, having broken away from the general Jewish community and lobbied the Ottoman state for separate recognition. The Camundo family was instrumental in this effort, active in forming the constitution, school planning, formulating the separate administration, a new synagogue, and a cemetery. The languages used in the Bank Camundo for official documents reflect this shift from subjects to citizens of a newly formed nation state. For example, the Camundo banking records from 1833 through 1858 are in Hebrew, from 1858 to 1866 in Italian, and after 1866 in French. Abraham Solomon Camundo was naturalized as an Italian citizen in 1865 in Constantinople. Only a few years prior to that, he went to Vienna, representing the Austrian colony in Istanbul or Constantinople. And he went there to congratulate Emperor Franz Joseph I on his marriage. And Camundo received a special medal from Franz Joseph as a citizen of honor. It was more a matter of layering identities than switching loyalties from empire to nation state. for the Italian Jews in 19th century Constantinople, Izmir, and Salonika. Through a series of charitable works, Abraham Solomon Camundo established his credibility with the Italian state. So he gave money to an orphanage in Turin, and he helped start an Italian school in Constantinople and an Italian hospital there. And by 1867, these activities were rewarded when Camundo was given an aristocratic title as Count, which was transferable to his male heirs. And also, interestingly, his bank, Camundo, was one of the financing organizations of the 1869 Suez Canal project. The process of layering identities plays out with several prominent Jewish families in Salonika and Constantinople. One of these families is the Morpurgos, who are related to the Alatinis of Salonika by marriage and business partnerships. The Morpurgos have their origins in Marburg in Central Europe, and their banking business started when they were given a concession from Fernando II de' Medici, the Grand Duke of Tuscany, in the 17th century. The Morpurgos moved around Central Europe and were based out of Trieste and Salonika, with business concerns in the 19th century throughout Istria. They had publishing house in Split, they owned newspapers, and they also had business interests in Tunisia and Egypt. Their bank did commerce as a loaning institution in the Ottoman Empire in Egypt. Carlo Marco Morpurgo was awarded a number of titles and awards from Tunisia, the Ottoman Empire, Italy, the Republic of San Marino, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Spain, and France, all between 1861 and 1872. The two paintings of Carlo that are in the Civic Museum of Trieste today show him wearing his Medjidia fifth class medal, which was awarded in 1866 by the Ottoman Emperor. As Benedetti observed, Carlo had that brilliant jewel a little hidden under his lapel, because while Austria had granted permission for him to accept it, they did not want the flashy jewel on display. Thus, holding multiple citizenships was a balancing act, so that the rewards in one context did not disturb one's connection to an imperial rival. Italian Jews as agents of modernity in the Ottoman Empire. The establishment of a new Italian nation state meant new business and educational opportunities. For many centuries, Jews had been completing their medical training in Italy. The 19th century saw new innovations with the field of modern engineering in Italy as part of the Italian national project. Jews were not the only non-Muslim Ottoman communities to take advantage of these opportunities in Italy. For example, in the late 19th century, the Public Works Department in Constantinople were all Armenians who had trained in Italy in engineering. Technology transfer from Italy meant that Jews were active as agents for foreign companies, as Italian consulate personnel. One of my favorite characters is Sal Fernandez, who was the Italian Tuscan consul in Salonika. And most importantly, in the area of financing for new ventures. The Modiano, Morpurgo, Alatini, and Camundo families all engaged in multiple businesses with banking at the core and manufacturing products that could be distributed throughout the Mediterranean. For example, the famous Alatini flour mill in Salonika, their main clients were in Egypt. Improved steamship travel meant that in the 19th century, people could get around more quickly and more reliable than previously. And Italian Jews also started the insurance business for shipping as well. Another innovation were elevators. We know about the ascenseur, the famous elevator in Izmir. It was built by Nassim Levy in 1907. So it made it easier to carry goods and people from one level of the city up the steep hill to the other. And it was similar to an elevator built in Lisbon in 1902, also by a Jewish engineer. Italian Jews built other public works and commercial centers that provided jobs. The Alatinis of Salonika not only had the commercial flour mill, but also a brick works and agricultural concerns. There's actually a village called Alatini outside of Salonika. Saul Modiano developed Cité Saul, a commercial center in Salonika. Eli Modiano studied architecture and engineering in Paris and planned the Salonika Customs House and the Agora Modiano, the Modiano Market, which still stands today in Salonika. 700 people worked there prior to World War II. Today it still exists and it's popular for its ouzo bars. A different Saul Modiano built a glass factory in Paşabahçe in Istanbul, which continues today. Well, conclusions. Throughout the 19th century, there were certain advantages for assuming an Italian identity for Jewish businessmen in the Ottoman Empire. Many of Los Francos, or the Italian Jews in the Ottoman Empire, were not foreign Jews at all, but rather obtained that status through the capitulations, becoming protégés or agents of foreign companies. Several of the prominent Ottoman Jewish families, the Comundos and the Modianos, had stumbled upon this strategy while fleeing to Trieste to escape harsh penalties during the period when the Janissaries were abolished. They took Austrian protection and reestablished in Constantinople as Austrians prior to the declaration of the modern Italian state. And also prior to the declaration of the modern Italian state, Italian identity was localized around certain cities like Livorno or Venice, or regional centers like Tuscany. These areas were part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and then later Napoleonic France. Jewish businessmen took multiple identities in order to obtain protection and tax breaks in the Ottoman Empire. Italian citizenship and aristocratic titles were available during the unification, which appealed to transnational Ottoman Jewish families, particularly those in banking and industry. Such titles and Italian citizenship offered potentially more opportunity and the expansion for markets in numerous port cities. This strategy worked great until 1911, when Italy declared war on the Ottoman Empire in North Africa, in the area that is today's Libya. Ottoman authorities rounded up Italian nationals during that war in Salonika and expelled them to Italy. At that point, some of the Modianos reactivated their Austro-Hungarian credentials and went to Hungary. The story of the Italian Jews in the late Ottoman Empire illustrates the malleability and intentional aspects of creating a national identity. Perhaps we might call this group pan-Mediterranean Jews, which is more apt since each of these prominent families had branches in several cities. The Italian Jewish identity in the Ottoman Empire was generally subsumed by the dominant Sephardic identity after 1911 and the emerging national identities, Greek, Turkish, Bulgarian. The importance of studying Italian Jewish identity in the Ottoman Empire is that it provides a window into the complexity of intercommunal relations and commerce. It allows us to see the actors as individuals and families strategizing for their survival in an unpredictable and changing world where political events rapidly introduced new variables. Thank you.
Thank you, Pam. That was very interesting. Our last speaker is Louis Fishman. He's an associate professor at Brooklyn College in New York, and he writes on Turkish and Israeli-Palestinian affairs. And he has lived most of his life between the US, Israel, and Turkey, and he's a regular contributor at Haaretz.
Very good. First of all, thanks so much for having me. And it was great to see on Facebook when you brought up the idea of having talks, because usually I'm confined to more academic communities, and it's nice, I think, and it's a really honor to have the chance to speak to people that my history actually means something personally, because many people here I imagine this history has shaped your lives as well, whether it's your lives or your parents' lives or could be your children's lives. Let me go ahead. I'm going to just do about a 15, 20-minute talk. And I got about 12 or 13 different slides on a PowerPoint. So let me go ahead and open up that. I'm going to do share screen here, and then we go right to 1 second. It should be right here. Good. So you guys can see that? You can see it okay? Perfect. So I'm even going to do this and do full screen. 1 second. 1 second. It should be F5, isn't it? It's not working. Okay. Well, I won't do that. Then I'll just leave it like this. Good. So my talk today is called real fast. How do you do the full screen? F what? Does anyone know? Karen, do you know how to do the full screen? Is it F5? There we go. Great. You have the full screen now? Perfect. Yes. Great. Very good. Sorry about that. So yeah. So today today's talk will be Ottoman Jews, and I write Sephardim without borders. And this is a talk for the Sephardic family today that I have prepared. So first we're going to start looking at what I'm going to be doing. So really this talk is going to be looking at the transformation of Sephardim different times from the late 19th century, early 20th century until basically around World War I. Now, a lot of this is work that I have done for a book that just came out during the pandemic. This is my new book. It's going to be out in paperback in exactly about a month and a half. So right now it's about $100. In about a month and a half, it should be about $25. So I'll go ahead and give that, a heads up, and you can look at that. And really what it does, the book itself is not only about Sephardic Jews, but it is about the politics of what's happening in Istanbul in the 1908 to 1914 period, what's happening with the Jewish community, both in Istanbul and in Palestine, which we'll be talking about today. And it also looks at I would say, the beginnings of the conflict, because it's during this period that the Palestinians start defining themselves as Palestinians also. So this is really what the book looks at. Just to give you a heads up, coming out probably in the next couple months, there should be an article of mine about memories of Jews where they don't exist. That's also something that I've been doing, that I've been working on memory of Jews in Turkey, looking at places such as Akhisar and Tire and Sultanbeyli, where there used to be Ashkenazi Jewish communities. So going to these places and looking at the refurbishing of synagogues, both by the state and by local municipalities, and different art projects that are done by Turkish Muslims, which is strange because often I would never call them Turkish Muslims, but de facto, I usually call them by non-Jews. So that's some new work that will be coming out. But today, today's topic is really me exploring with you this new idea about, connecting Ottoman Palestine, not only with Istanbul, but also with Cairo. This is something very new that I've been doing. And what I see here is that the Jewish Sephardic community had many networks within these different Ottoman lands. And of course, the argument's going to be, when I get towards the end of the talk, is that the foundation of the nation states is really going to affect the Sephardic Jews in a very traumatic way, I would say, and really cut them off from future understandings of this mutual world that they live together. So I'll be highlighting that in the talk today. So if we look at from the late 19th century, actually leaving very much off where Pam had been speaking about the Tanzimat and the different reforms, and what Karen had been speaking about the Alliance Universelle, is that we see that the Sephardic community during the late 19th century goes from multiple communities to unifying into one community that's united. And then it goes back to these very divisive borders. that's going to transform it again. So the idea here, once again, is from multiple communities to unity to divisions. Now, looking at today, we'll be looking at mostly Ottoman Jerusalem, Istanbul, but I will be talking about the two major trends, and also looking at Salonika and Cairo, but for now, mostly only focusing on Ottoman Jerusalem, and that is the Jewish Yishuv. We'll be talking about the Jewish Yishuv and the integration into this new idea of a homeland, in a modern homeland that is actually a tangible community where these new divisions, divisions between Ashkenazi and Sephardic are disappearing, with them being connected by the Hebrew language, adopting of the Hebrew language. In Istanbul, the trend we'll be talking about today is integration within the society in Istanbul, but also exclusion to a great extent by a new form of anti-Semitism, actually. This is all we're talking about in the early 1900s. Now, Salonika, we're not going to talk about much, but it will come up because it was the heart of the Young Turk revolutionaries where they sort of embarked on their revolution, and it would be cut off in 1913. So the idea of losing Salonika or Selanik is going to, I think, give us an example of what the Ottoman Jewish community will look after it starts being divided by these new borders. And if we talk about Cairo at the very end, I'll mention something about Cairo. So here we have a map of the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire. So if we look, I don't know if you can see the cursor, today we'll be speaking mostly about the Jewish community in Istanbul. We'll be mentioning in a second about Edirne, just for quickly, and then we have Saloniki. Saloniki is not on the map here, but it would be here. And of course, we have Jerusalem. We have other communities, big communities in Damascus and the Hatay region. And what we're going to see is, especially from my work on my later work, is that up into the early 20s, Jews were in numerous cities in the Ottoman Turkey, in this huge territory of Anatolia. Today, that memory of them has been forgotten, and I've been writing about how it's being revived. Now, already in the late 19th century, you start seeing, I think, this idea of the Turkish community as a whole. This is also internally, this is also externally. So here's just a small little clipping that I share with my students, and it's, Israelites in Turkey. There's 500, this is from the New York Times, statistics received from the United States minister, 500,000 Hebrews in the Ottoman Empire. They are better treated than the Christians by the Turks, protection extended by the United States officials. So we're already seeing here, I think, sort of this sort of always comparing with also Europe and how Jews are treated vis-a-vis the Ottoman authorities and the Jewish community, and how that plays out in Europe as well. Now, when I talk about unity from multiple communities to unity, I think it's a nice example to show is the new in 1907 the opening of the Grand Synagogue in Edirne, that was fashioned after the Grand Synagogue of Vienna, that's recently in the last couple of years has been refurbished and revived, also by the Istanbul Jewish community going back and praying on it in certain holidays and keeping it open, keeping it alive. This is really interesting for my later work. But for this work today, it's important to remember that this synagogue, this huge grand synagogue, replaced 13 different synagogues. So we have to remember that the transformation to modernization, transformation through the Alliance schools and through, I would say, the politicization of the community, is that you also have this new unifying factor where all these different groups start uniting together under one synagogue. And we have to remember that, even up into the mid-19th century, different also among Sephardic communities, but definitely among Sephardi and Ashkenazi communities, didn't necessarily marry with each other either. It was intermarriage could be from a different Sephardic synagogue within the same city. So this idea of, multiple communities, unity is really strong during this period. And that is what I'm talking about. I'm juxtaposing it to the divisions later on. So we're coming to Ottoman Palestine. And I think, basing this talk or coming after Karen is great, and Pam, because what comes up with these communities they were multilingual communities often. And by the early 20th century, that multilingualism is going to be replaced by a nation state language. So the idea is not just having Ladino, but also having different language. Now, what makes the Sephardic community very different in Palestine was that they weren't only former people from Spain or from the background from Spain, or sometimes they were from Spanish background that had been Arabized also. Okay, so we don't have, on this one, we don't actually need Ladino because it's an official, I would say it's an official document. But we know that among the Sephardic Jews, even if you don't have Ladino here, the majority language spoken in Jerusalem during this time among Sephardic Jews was Ladino. I'm talking about around 1908. I think they're talking about 70% of the community spoke Ladino at home. So this is really good. This is going to be interesting. With another talk another paper I'm writing, and historians have tended to put, I think, too much emphasis on them being Arab Jews and speaking Arabic. And I say, no, really, among all the communities, Jerusalem is connected to Istanbul in a very, very tight way. Not Damascus, definitely not Baghdad, okay? In terms of language, Damascus, the far majority by then were Arabic speakers. But in Palestine, there was this connection, especially between Jerusalem and Istanbul, between the two cities. So we have, we have the Hebrew, Rabbanut Rashid by Eretz HaKodesh. Then we have the Turkish right here, right? Or Arabic, Haham Basha Palestine. For my work is pretty important because they talked about in Arabic translated to Palestine, Eretz Israel. And then we have it in French. So this is the official letterhead. I use it in my other work. So now let's look at the Palestine's Jewish community quickly. Defining Palestine's Jewish community is a difficult task because you have, on one hand, you have large Ashkenazi population, you have Sephardi Jews, Sephardim that were there, immigrants from Eastern Europe, Arab lands, Balkans, North Africa. So you have many languages they're living in. So of course, languages spoken in Jerusalem during this period is Yiddish, Russian, Ladino, and multiple dialects of Arabic and Persian. So we really have, I think when we look at the Sephardic community here, this is not just Ladino, these are the Eastern communities united under the Sephardic rabbinate. Okay, and that makes the dynamics different. Now, following the Young Turk Revolution of 1908, which was I would say that the moment where modern Turkish history really begins, and I would say it's more of a secular elite take hold of the country, then this is when you also have this hodgepodge of communities, what I call unite under the banner of adopting Hebrew as their mother tongue. And very importantly, by 1911, they are no longer the Ladino paper, the Judeo-Arabic paper, Yiddish papers. They're being pushed aside for Hebrew papers. So the Sephardic newspaper, which we'll see in a second, HaCherut, is in Hebrew. So this is very important to transforming them into this new community of Hebrew speakers. And very important, I argue that the adopting Hebrew connects Zionists and anti-Zionists into one group, because we'll come back to that when we talk about Eastern. Now, what's interesting is that these newspapers are also talking about what the Ottoman authorities are talking about them. And this is the governor of Jerusalem is interviewed in Cairo, and the interview is translated to Hebrew. Mejdi Bey and other Ottoman authorities were visiting all the Jewish communities in Palestine, including Zionist ones. That's part of my book. So there is this really tight relation now with the Ottoman authorities. Now, what do I argue? And I think this is very important to understand how in the modern period, in the post-1908 period, the Jewish communities of the Ottoman Empire actually come closer to Istanbul. So I write the Ottoman Jewish community, whether in Palestine or Istanbul, started to use other non-Muslim communities as a model to receive autonomous rights. And that's very, very important in Palestine. They look at Armenians and Greeks and they said, you know what? They are moving towards autonomy. Through this, we are going to have an autonomous Hebrew-speaking community in Palestine. In a few minutes, we'll come to Istanbul, talk about that. So what I argue is that this idea of the revolution bringing equality between all the peoples, I say that Ottoman equality was not a horizontal equality, but one that offered equality between the non-Muslims and the inner Istanbul center pole. So basically, equality meant not a across-the-board equality for everyone. Rather, Jews were vying for equality or recognition as a legitimate community from the new Muslim secular elite in Istanbul, which is going to be very important because this really shows us the dynamics, what happens in modern Turkey later on. Okay, and I think that's something key here that we have to remember. Now, so Ottomanism, this new idea of Ottoman patriotism, connected the local Jewish community with Istanbul, yet separated them from Palestinians inside Palestine itself. And that's what I argue is the beginning of the conflict. Let me quickly move. I only think I have about 5 more minutes. Now, once again, back to this idea of unity among Sephardic communities. This is from the newspaper Hacherut, and it says, Hitorut Sephardim, the awakening of the Sephardic community, and it's uniting together under the Ottoman Jews, right? So what we have now for the first time, I would say this idea that they want to form organizations to connect all the different Jewish communities, Sephardic Jewish communities within the Ottoman Empire. Okay, and I think this is a major moment where we see Jews in Cairo connecting with Istanbul, connecting with Beirut, connecting with Jerusalem. Okay, and remember this is in 1914, so Salonika is no longer part of the Ottoman Empire. Now let's look briefly at Istanbul. And I look at Istanbul that the Jewish community during this period is divided between what I call Ottomanism, is a very strong patriotism for the Ottoman Empire. We know that after the Young Turk Revolution in 1908, you have 4 parliamentarians, Jewish parliamentarians voted. They are an integral part of the politics of Istanbul. This is going to end during the Turkish period. Okay, so perhaps 1909 would be the heyday for Jewish participation in the Ottoman politics, and also including later on for modern Turkey. So I quote here Nisim Mazliak, who was an Ottoman parliamentarian. Now, for me, he really shows us, I would say, this idea of what I was talking about, the mobility of these different, of the area that they're working within, right? The mobility, the Sephardic Jews' mobility during this period. So we have someone that's born in the late 1870s in Manisa, what is in modern Turkey today. He goes to Salonika to study in before 1908. He gets his law degree there. He comes back as a proud politician running for parliament for the CEP, right, in Izmir. And he prided himself that he got more Muslim votes than Jewish votes also during the election. Okay, and then he serves in the parliament in Istanbul. So we see through these people the amount of mobility of, yes, it's perfectly normal that someone's born in Manisa will go to Selanik to study, will come back to Izmir, and then we'll go to Istanbul. Okay, and what does he say about Zionism? Now, I would say in a second, we're going to see that many of the Ottoman Jews within Istanbul were a bit suspicious of Zionism, and some they went, I would say there was a scale where some were very pro-Zionist. A great majority had, I think, some sympathy towards it. Well, there were the staunch anti-Zionists of Palestine. But this is what Mazliach wrote. He actually saw Zionism as a cultural revolution for Jews. And for the Ottoman Jews, they didn't need to go to Palestine. That was part of the Ottoman Empire, right? So he says, I choose our Hebrew language as a national language among all other languages. In our primary schools, in our Talmud Torah schools, and in our kindergartens. Hebrew should be the language of instruction and speech. Of course, in the middle schools, which are supported by the government, Turkish should be the dominant language. So we already have the tension between the different languages. Here, there's no tension now. Here, there is a nice idea that Hebrew is going to be the language for their young kids. Now, of course, this comes on the account of Ladino, which we'll come back to. We're almost here. Now we have a picture of the newspaper El Tiempo, which is the Ladino newspaper, and the El Tiempo, more than any other newspaper, was I would say, the bastion of anti-Zionist rhetoric by David Fresco. But we have to understand that there was different types of anti-Zionism, where David Fresco was, I would say, staunchly anti-Zionist. Chaim Nachum, who, to his dying day, never moved to Israel, ended up being the chief rabbi in Egypt. He never saw his help of the Jewish community, including the Zionist community in Palestine, as helping Zionists, rather as helping the Jewish community. And I think that was, so Chaim Nachum was against Zionism as a separatist movement, but he definitely saw himself as representing the Jewish community in Palestine. Okay, so he is, I would say, anti-Zionism in the terms of creating a separatist state. During this period, most Zionists are saying, you know what? We don't need an independent state. We're going to build an autonomous homeland in Palestine under Ottoman rule. So for Chaim Nachum, there's really no, I would say, clash of ideology. Now, during this period, there were numerous rumors that the Young Turks were connected to Zionism, that they were actually helping Zionists. I found very little truth to this for the most part, but we do see that there is this new wave of anti-Semitism hitting Istanbul, the capital. I look at that in my book in a great deal about Ottoman debates, and this was making and I would say stirring up worries among the Jewish community in Istanbul. And what's ironic enough, the Zionism and the anti-Semitism had very little to do with Palestine, but it actually had to do with Jewish-Turkish relations in Istanbul itself. And so these conspiracy theories that Zionists were behind the Young Turk Revolution. Now, during this period, once again, Ashkenazis are coming into the picture in terms of when they talk about unity. David Ben-Gurion, no one really knew who he was during this period in 1911-12 when he comes there. He founds the Agudat Mitlamdim Ivrim Ottomani Bakushta, of course, Istanbul being Kushta, the student club, the student union of Hebrew students in Istanbul. Now, this is interesting because he writes in Rashi script here, okay, and I don't really read Rashi script, unfortunately. And if I do start with Ladino, I have to start with doing Rashi. But this I have also I can read it enough, but I have also in the Hebrew press, this same report So, what he's talking about basically is like, wow, all these other communities have student unions. Why isn't there a student union for Jewish students? And many Sephardic Jews take part in this. Now, all of this leads to the Ottoman authorities. When you go in the archives, the fear of the Ottoman authorities that Zionism is actually a separatist movement. And this is a government report about the Maccabi sports clubs and social clubs in Istanbul. So this is really warning. The Ottomans are saying, the Jewish community in Istanbul have these clubs, but we think there's something more to them here. We need to keep an eye on. Surprising enough, we only have, I would say, 2 or 3 documents to say that they were really tracking Zionism within Istanbul. But this is one of them, where they want to investigate these, Musevi Gençleri, it says, right? The Jewish youth clubs of Maccabi. This is around 1912, 13. Now, quickly, we're coming to an end. The tensions, I would say, we talked about, I just wanted to highlight, because we really have in Istanbul this idea of transformation from a Ladino-speaking community to a French-speaking community, the idea of the Alliance, and Karen had mentioned that before. But by the early 20th century, you really have a trend towards adopting Turkish as the language, second language of all. And not only French, but also, that you have to learn Turkish if you're going to be part of the everyday life. In Palestine, you see something very different. It's Ladino to French, but then Hebrew takes over. Hebrew really becomes the main force of the transformative language. And then you also have Judeo-Arabic transformed to Hebrew speakers. To go ahead and to end right now, my conclusions. World War I would create new borders, and these new borders would create new divisions with the Sephardic community. And I think that when I talked about before that a lot of this history affected your families of people here today, this is it right here, right? The idea that you just can't pick up and move from Jerusalem to Istanbul to Sarajevo, right? Really transforms the community. Of course, you do already have the immigration of Sephardic Jews to South America and different places in North America. That had already started. But I think even within that these new divisions would only induce more reasons to leave, because you have, of course, the rise of local nationalisms. For many, and I say Greek and Turkish Jews, I think, Pam, you smiled when people say that, a lot of times when I first came in touch with, way before I was a student, people from Saloniki and in Israel, they would say, oh, we're Greek Jews, or we're Turkish Jews, or we're Bulgarian Jews, right? Of course, it was, before 1914 or before the Balkan Wars, they were all basically Sephardic Jews, and not necessarily knowing the language. But it's actually this moment of nationalism that leads to the end of these communities, unfortunately, to a great deal. So I put it was the beginning of the exiting from the homeland to the new old homeland, and that's Palestine. Okay, by 1920s and 30s, with the 1934 events, even before the 1934 events in Thrace that Karen talked about, and the other, the wealth tax, Jews had already started slowly moving to Palestine. Also in Jerusalem, the Sephardic Jews, such as Abraham el-Malik, would transform and force into a new reality. And el-Malik was someone interesting because he's of Moroccan Jewish background. But when the chief rabbi comes to Palestine in 1909, he picks up and goes back to Istanbul with him. He starts teaching Hebrew in Istanbul. Later on, he ends up teaching as a school principal in Damascus. And from Damascus, he comes back to Palestine in 1914 And really, I would say this is literally months before the war starts. By then, there is now, by early 1914, there's a clear clash between what Palestinians see as their homeland and what Jews see as their homeland. And this really transforms the lives of the Sephardic elite that really was moving back and forth from Istanbul, but also to Cairo, Alexandria, and other places in Egypt. So I will go ahead and stop there. I hope that wasn't too much information, and I would love to answer any questions people might have. Thanks so much.
Very interesting. Thank you, Louis. Before we get into a quick Q&A, I just wanted to mention that we have some upcoming events by our Sephardic family on January 10th, genealogy, January 21st on music, February 4th on Ladino language, February 18th on food. So contact me if you want information. If you're not in our Sephardic family, you are all welcome to join. I am going to unmute everyone, or I'm going to allow you to unmute yourselves if you have any questions.
Aaron. Hi, Professor Sezgin. I have a question for you. My grandmother's last name is Capuano. Capuano. That obviously they came from Capua. There's no doubt about it. But they used to live in the Galata Tower in that area. So my question is, when they moved from Spain, and as far as I understand, they went first to Turkey. They switched their name when they are back into Italy because they ended in Turkey back again. So right. I'm trying to understand how the migration could be that, and normally an Italian last name that obviously not originate in Spain because it has nothing to do with Spain, how they managed to pick that name and continue with that name, like Modiano, Capuano, all those names.
Right. Well, these are place names. And that's a very good question. And one of these tricky things to investigate in genealogy, right? But we should know, first of all, Jews have been in Italy from the Roman times, right? So there were old communities in Italy of Jewish communities, and they were still there. And after the expulsion from Spain, some Jews from Spain went to Italy, and often you might have changed your name to a locality. It's very common in all Jewish communities, East and West, Ashkenaz, Mizrach, Sepharad, to take the name of a city, where the family is based. Right. And so sometimes you have the continuity in time of your family name for a long time, but other times it's possible it could have changed. I mean, for example, in Turkey or here in the United States, many people have changed their names. My grandfather's brother changed the name of my father's family because of the anti-Semitism in the 1930s here in the United States, right? And I have many, the Turkish naming patterns. You can have a Turkish first name like Necdet, and then have a Jewish last name, Fresco, Necdet Fresco, just as an example. Or you can become Ak Kohen or Uz Kohen, right? Put a Turkish thing on it to prefix to make it more recognizable to the Turks so it doesn't look foreign, right? And so naming is very interesting, but again, many of the families I've been researching or who've come up in this Italian Jewish research in the Ottoman Empire, their connection to Italy was nebulous. The Modianos were supposedly from a certain place in Italy, but they're not in the cemeteries there, right? So it's there's, and the Comundos, they have a myth of Italian origin. We know, mainly they're really paradigmatically Ottoman Jews, Osmanli, right? But this was. We use our identities, to survive, right? We have to modify things.
It's amazing what you just said because on my grandmother's last name is Moreno. That is a typical, and I don't know if you ever heard the origin of the name Moreno. It's not just the dark color. It came actually from the Romanoids that they used to call more teacher. No, our teacher.
Oh, I love that. It has
Yeah, and
meanings
they
in
use
2 different languages.
correct, and that they use the name Moreno. And when my family moved from Turkey, they ended in Mexico. I was born in Mexico. My last name Israel was not the best last name, you know, to be. My father, they took my grandmother's last name.
Bravo.
So the whole family in Mexico, because they were afraid of anti-Semitism, they were Mr. and Mrs. Moreno. We were the only one that we got back, but all the legal papers, they were the Israel, but for everyone in the non-Jewish community, they were the Morenos. Thank you again, Professor Sezgin.
Thank you. Good question.
Does anyone else have any other questions? Okay, I think that's a wrap. And I thank you everyone for coming, and I hope to see you at some of our other events. And if you're not in our Sephardic family, please join us. So have a great day, everyone, and we'll talk again.
Okay. Thank you.
Nice meeting
Thanks
everyone.
again,
Bye-bye.
Dr.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.